presenter this evening is Gerry Rooney. Gerry is the president of the Whitfield-Majiro Friendship Society of Fairhaven, Massachusetts. I met Gerry over a year ago at an event sponsored by the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Each of the participants was asked to introduce themselves and to explain a little bit about their organization. As Gerry spoke, I became increasingly interested in the story that he was telling, and I immediately thought, wouldn't he be a great speaker for Tales of Cape Cod? So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome him this evening. Gerry is a graduate of UMass Amherst. He has traveled the world and written extensively about his travels. He has been recognized by the Foreign Minister of Japan and is also the recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun. The Order of the Rising Sun is the third most prestigious award given by the Japanese government, but it is probably the most frequent award given to civilians. The order is awarded to those who have distinguished achievements in international relations, promotions of Japanese culture, advancements in their field, and development in welfare and preservation of the environment. Please join me in welcoming Gerry.
Good evening. First of all, you may wonder if you know the whole complete name that I have. I am the product of two Scottish immigrants. So with a name like Gerald Patrick Rooney, probably wondering how the heck did this guy get involved with Japan? Well, that's the other half of the story. The other half of the story, I'd like you to welcome also my wife, Ayako, who is in the back of the room over here. We've got a lot to talk about with a fellow named Manjiro, but before we do that, I want to show a short clip. It's about 8 minutes long to put you in the mood, and then we'll fill all the details in later on, okay? So, if we're ready. Hello, my name is Gerry Rooney. I'm the chairman of the Whitfield-Majiro Friendship Society. Our organization is located in Fairhaven, Massachusetts on Buzzards Bay, adjacent to the fishing port of New Bedford. As you can see by the map, it's about 1 hour south of Boston and about 4 hours from New York City by car. Fairhaven was the home of Captain William Whitfield of the whaler John Howland, which rescued Manjiro and his four mates from Torishima in 1841. When Manjiro came back to the captain's house at 11 Cherry Street, he became the first Japanese person to live in the USA. In 1987, two notable events occurred in Fairhaven. The current emperor and his wife came to visit us as the crown prince and princess. And we signed the sister city agreement with Tosa Shimizu, the city which includes the village of Nakanohama, Manjiro's hometown. Since that time, we've had a continual flow of exchanges with students, officials, artists, little leaguers, quilters, and common citizens. When others visit Fairhaven, they usually wish to view the sites of the Manjiro Trail, those locations which are important in the history of Manjiro's time in Fairhaven. In 1918, the ambassador of Japan, Viscount Ishii, presented a samurai sword to the town of Fairhaven from Toichiro, the son of Manjiro, in thanksgiving for the hospitality shown to his father. On that occasion, the dignitary signed the logbook in the Millicent Library, which had been initiated by Henry Huddleston Rogers, who built the library and many other notable buildings in the town. In 1987, Emperor Akihito and his wife signed the same book. Visitors are allowed to sign it also by appointment. The old Unitarian Church. When Manjiro received a negative reception at the Captain's Church, they moved to the Unitarian Church, which is now a restored building housing an international school for seamanship. The monument in front notes the relationship. The building also houses the Northeast Restoration Group, which volunteered to oversee the restoration of Captain William Whitfield's house at no cost. Shortly after his arrival in Fairhaven, the captain left Manjiro in the care of his neighborhood friend, Ibn Aiken, while he went to New York to marry his second wife, Albertina. Ruth, his first wife, had died at 31 years of age. Manjiro wanted to go to school, but had had no formal learning when he arrived in Fairhaven. At 16 years of age, he would have been one of the biggest students in the one-room school. Thus, Captain Whitfield's neighbor, Miss Jane Allen, tutored Manjiro to prepare him for the classroom. Lessons were generally taught in the downstairs kitchen, where Manjiro reportedly developed a liking for homemade cookies. The Old Stone School. Here Manjiro received his first schooling ever. He was a very astute student and learned very quickly. He learned his ABCs, basic math, and some social studies here. The Lewis Bartlett School. At this academy, Manjiro learned higher-level math, surveying, boat building, and navigation. He also served an apprenticeship in coopering, barrel making, as the barrels were so important to the whaling industry. Riverside Cemetery. Here are buried the captain and his family, where visitors pay their respects to this kind man who was so instrumental in initiating bonds of friendship between the USA and Japan. This lot contains modern burial sites of other family members as well. This home at 11 Cherry Street, which had been gutted, was put on the market for sale and was rescued as a significant historic building by the amazing fundraising efforts of supporters led by Dr. Hinohara. The building, including the carriage house, which will become the cultural center, were purchased and are in the process of being renovated. On May 7th, Dr. Hinohara led a group of more than 100 Japanese supporters to the dedication of the Whitfield-Majiro Friendship House. This is phase 1 of the process. Earlier, at an opening ceremony in Town Hall, Dr. Hinohara presented the signed deed to Dr. Brian Bocock, chairman of the Fairhaven Selectmen. Dr. Bocock read a proclamation from the town declaring May 7th as Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara Day.
To hereby proclaim our mutual intent this 7th day of May 2009 as Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara Day.
As well, a representative of Mayor Scott Lang of New Bedford read a resolution for the occasion. This event was attended by 8 descendants of Manjiro who had traveled from Japan, as well as 3 members of the Whitfield family from Maryland. A greeting was also offered by Mr. Masaru Tsuji, recently appointed Consul General of the Boston area. At the Unitarian Church, the guests were treated to a concert by the visiting Shigeaki Hinohara Festival Orchestra. At the dedication of the house, Dr. Hinohara officiated as he unveiled the new sign of the museum. As the group of visitors and local officials gathered for lunch, the toast was presented by Manjiro historian Junji Kitadai.
In the spirit of Captain Whitfield and Manjiro, I'd like to propose a toast. We wish the Friendship House will prosper as the symbol of everlasting friendship of the people of the United States and people of Japan. Kanpai.
The Kanpai toast was done with water as a symbol of the ocean that brought Captain Whitfield and Manjiro together. After lunch, the citizens of Japan and the USA continued their person-to-person exchange throughout the rest of the day in the Friendship House. Here, Kei Nakahama chats with Kathy Whitfield about an old photo. So all of you are cordially invited to visit the Manjiro Trail. There you can witness for yourselves the places in which Captain Whitfield and Manjiro shared space and time. This guide will be waiting to assist you in your tour. It is in both English and Japanese. Thank you so much for your attention. Please come to visit us at the Whitfield-Majiro Friendship House in Fairhaven, Manjiro's second hometown.
But first of all, let me go back to 1841 and give you a little background on Manjiro himself. He lived in a small village called Nakanohama. You may be familiar with the general geography of Japan. Way up at the top, you have this big island called Hokkaido. It's the same latitude as here. Then you get the big banana, and then the one hanging off the end, that's Kyushu, and then a little one in between. That little one in between is called Shikoku, which literally means 4 prefectures, which are states. And that's where Manjiro lived, in a small village. His dad had already died when he was 9 years old. His older brother was very sickly. He had 2 older sisters and a younger sister, and his mother was fine. So he became the man of the family at 14 years of age, had to go out and work, never went to school in Japan. So he decided to go fishing with a few other fellows, and he didn't go from his own port. He went about 100 miles away to a place called Tosa City. And the port that he went out from was called Usa. And I had a tour just yesterday with Japanese people coming, and I said, now, if you wrote USA in our Roman language, how do you spell it? And they figure for a while, they say, USA, Beikoko, yeah, exactly right. So he left from USA and ended up here as well. The other fellows, one of them, the skipper of that thing was called Fudenojo, and he had 2 brothers went with him, Chosuke and Goemon, and their neighbor Torimon also went with him. So there were 5 of them together in this little boat, went out to catch fish, and they got caught in a huge storm. They lost the mast and the steering, bobbed around the ocean for 3 or 4 days, ended up crashing on an island called Torishima. It's about 800 miles south of Tokyo. There was no one else on that island. There were just what we call ohodori, albatross birds, nesting site. So this was in January, by the way. They waited 6 months, almost died. Finally, the John Howland ship from New Bedford, a whaling ship, came there, and we have a copy of the captain's logbook. And on that day, the captain says, this day was a light wind from the southeast. The island is in sight. At 1 p.m., send in 2 boats to see if there are any turtles. When I say that to Japanese, what do they want, turtles? They're going to play? No. That was the time when Japan was a closed country. For over 200 years, you couldn't go in or out. So the foreign vessels had to go to the little islands and look for food of any kind. So in this case, when they got there, they found 5 poor, distressed Japanese people almost dead. So they took them back to the ship. The captain recognized them as Japanese. He knew he could not take them back to Japan, so they stayed on the ship and went to Honolulu, Hawaii. It took until November. They caught 15 whales along the way. Now Manjiro, the youngest at 14, very special kind of young man, because he was not schooled, but very intelligent and very curious. So when that fellow at the top of the mast yelled, "There she blows!" he'd say, "What is that? What does that mean?" And he found out. So by the time they got to Hawaii, he had impressed the captain so much, the captain said, "Why don't you come to the United States and get some education?" So he agreed to stay on the ship. The other 4 stayed in Hawaii. They stopped at Guam for a short time, and then went around South America, no Panama Canal at that time, and then all the way up the Atlantic. In 1843, 2 years later, on May 6th, they came into New Bedford Harbor. And then they stayed there one day to report to the ship owners and the customs and so forth. The following day, walked across the old bridge, came to the captain's house, and Manjiro became the first Japanese to live in USA. That's where it was, at 11 Cherry Street in Fairhaven. Now, we know other Japanese came to the USA prior to that, but they were short-timers. They were transients. They didn't stay here. So, in fact, when they got here, the captain's house was only 2 stories high, And after Manjiro went back in 1852, talk about renovation, the captain had the house raised and put a new first floor under it. And then he put additional rooms in the back. So you'll see that if you have an opportunity to come and see us. So, so Manjiro then was going to go to his first school ever. It was a one-room school built in 1828. And as you're familiar with those times, the little house in the prairie and those kinds of things, there was one school teacher. The youngsters were from first grade to probably junior high school level. And one of the new high-tech things in there at that time was new slate blackboards. So it was very good for the teacher because teacher had a challenge with the little ones and the big ones. So she could take the first and second graders and put them here and the third and fourth over there and so forth, you know. By the way, the teachers were almost always women, almost all single. And the schedule was kind of a little bit different at times because most of those youngsters came from farms. So in the springtime, they had to help with the planting. And then in the autumn, they would go back and help with the harvest. So very often they were like that. So, so finally, after going back to 11 Cherry Street, only about 3 months later, the captain bought a farm in the area called Sconnecut Neck. And they moved out to the farm. So now, Manjiro could do something he could do in that farm he couldn't do in Japan. He could ride a horse. You had to be a samurai to ride a horse in Japan. He had his own horse and went to a different school out there. So one of the fellows who had been the first mate of the John Howland ship, Mr. Eben Aiken, he decided he was going to become a captain. He became captain of another whaling ship called the Cushionet. And in any event, he wanted to go back to that same area where they had met all the way around the world. And he knew Manjiro was a good sailor by then, so he talked Manjiro into going with him. So they went around. This time they didn't go around South America. They went around Africa. They stopped in the Azores. They stopped in Cape Verde. They went all the way around across the Indian Ocean and back to that area. But Captain Whitfield had warned the other captain, if he tries to go back into Japan, he's subject to death. So if it's very, very dangerous, don't let him go. And that's what happened. When they got over there, he tried to approach local people. They came after him. So the captain said, no, you've got to be back on the ship. So they stayed on the ship. They got some whales, and they came all the way back to New Bedford. Typical, as you would know, 3.5-year voyage. So people ask me at times, where did he live mostly? Mostly in ships, because took 2 years to get here, and then 3.5 years in the voyage, and so forth. Okay? But when he got back here at that time, he was really serious about trying to get home. So what he did was, he heard about a thing, it was 1849, little thing in California called the Gold Rush. He worked on another ship around South America, went to California, went to the gold fields. After about 5 or 6 months, he received about $600. And then with that, he was able to go back to Hawaii and then eventually back home. By the way, when he wanted to go from San Francisco to Hawaii, it's the first time he had to buy a ticket. Because all these other times, he worked his passage along the way. So ticket, by the way, at that time was $25, okay, from San Francisco to Hawaii. You can't get a good meal on the ship now for $25, right? In any event, and when he got back there to Hawaii, of course, he was looking for his other friends. Now, there were 3 brothers that came originally, and the middle brother, Jusuke, hurt his leg very badly at Torishima at that island when they crashed. He died from that in Hawaii. Their neighbor, a fellow named Torimon, he became a carpenter, married a Hawaiian lady, and didn't want to go back himself. So there were 3 of them who wanted to go back to Japan. They were helped by a missionary from New England to buy a small boat, and they gave it a name called Boken in Japanese, which is the Adventurer. And they found a big ship called the Sarah Boyd going to Shanghai, China, out of Hawaii. And they got permission to put the little boat on the ship. When they got near the Ryukyu Island, the Okinawa area, they then put it over the side, rode like crazy, and finally came back to Japan at Okinawa. Manjiro had been away from home for over 11 years by this time. He was 14 years old before when he went out. And of course, if you were Japanese and I showed you this, you'd understand they got arrested right away. And there was interrogations, both at the local village and then at the capital. And then in Nagasaki, they were interrogated for almost a whole year. Finally, they were allowed to go home. And when he got home, he was, all this time, by the way, thinking about Mother and worried about her. No communication whatsoever for 11 years and 10 months. And when he got home, Mother was, as we say in Japanese, Genki. good health, great. She is more surprised because she assumed by this time he died in the ocean. So she took him to the cemetery and showed him his own tombstone, which was already there. So I'm sure there must have been a big party that night. But in any event, only 3 days later, he had to go to Kochi City, the capital, start teaching English to young samurai. Excuse me. Problem was, he was going to teach the samurai, but he had never gone to school in Japan. He had no title. A non-titled peasant teach samurai. So they made him samurai at a very low level called hatamoto. So now he had a title, he could teach. So he taught, he taught whaling. He taught, one of the most important things he did, and it was one of the schools that was on this thing here on the video, he learned navigation, kokai as they say in Japanese. Because prior to that time, when Japanese ships went to the ocean, they had to stay within the sight of land. They didn't know how to go back otherwise. So when he learned navigation, he translated Bowditch's American Navigator Manual into Japanese and taught it there. And finally, in 1860, the first Japanese ship could cross the Pacific to California, to San Francisco. It was called the Kanrin Maru. And Manjiro was on that ship. The funny part about that story is that, of course, the fellows in the Japanese naval agency, all the Navy guys, all the captains and everyone else, they weren't used to going to the deep ocean because they're very close to the shore. They could see it. So now they're heading across the Pacific with 30-foot swells and waves and all. They all got sick. So Manjiro had to steer the ship into San Francisco, which they did. Okay. Well, while he was there, another thing he did, he picked up the first sewing machine that was introduced into Japan. It was not a Singer, it was a Wilson, by the way. In any event, the other fellow that was with him was a fellow named Fukuzawa, who established Keio University. It's like saying Harvard in Japan, Keio University. So they also bought a lot of dictionaries and English-speaking books, and Manjiro became the first teacher of English when he went back. Now, funny thing happened with the sewing machine. When they got back there, they passed it on to some guy who maybe we'd call an engineer or something like that, because he had to learn how to repair it. And they went through that process. He started taking the technology that was involved there and using it for other purposes. Before you know it, he made a typewriter. And from there, he just advanced. And in 1908, he incorporated his company. And then finally, when he was getting too old, his two sons took it over. And those two sons, of course, were brothers. And if you know anything about a lot of very good technical machinery, the Brothers Company is a huge company in Japan. And it came from the sewing machine Manjiro bought back, okay? Yeah. So Manjiro got married 3 times. His first wife died at 26 years of age. The second wife went off to like a monastery life, and he married a 3rd time. So I say the family tree is a little bit like a forest. You know, I don't figure everyone out. And luckily, one of the members of the family came and left with Ayako the family tree in Japanese writing. So she knows it, but we don't yet. If I'm real nice, maybe she'll let me know, okay? But in any event, so Manjiro he did a whole number of things. He started a school for the navigation, for whaling as well. He helped build the first whaling ship in Japan. Was not very successful, by the way. In any event, excuse me. So in his mid-40s, he had a stroke, which slowed him down quite a bit, okay? So he had to take it easy from there. So another thing, when we touch a bit of local history, you probably have, you're in this area, somewhere in July, you usually get an announcement that there's a Black Ship Festival in Newport, Rhode Island. And it has to do with Commodore Matthew Perry. Now, in 1853, Commodore Perry went into Japan to say to the shogun, please open some ports so that we can get all of our supplies and things here. And he said, I'll come back in 1 year for your answer. Now, he was in, the name of Tokyo at that time was Edo. So when he left, the Tokugawa shogun was really kind of shimpai. Because none of his people knew anything about these crazy American foreigners, but he heard about Manjiro. Excuse me. Excuse me. So 8 days later, Manjiro was brought to Edo. And when they came back in 1854, Manjiro assisted in the whole thing, and they signed the Treaty of Amity. and they opened two ports. One was Shimoda, which is west of Tokyo, and the other one is Hakodate, which is way up in Hokkaido, which coincidentally is 42 degrees north, just like we are here. So, turns out that Shimoda became the sister city to Newport, Rhode Island, because that's the hometown and the cemetery of Commodore Matthew Perry. And only last year, the mayor of Shimoda came to the Black Sheep Festivals, and when he came there, before he got there, his coordinator got in touch with me because he wanted to see the whole Manjiro Trail and see what happened with Manjiro and that. So we hosted him. Terrific guy. So finally, Manjiro, in 1898, he was 71 years old, was living with his first son, who was a medical doctor in Tokyo, and he died there at his son's house. And he's buried in Tokyo at a cemetery called Zoshigaya, and we've been there a couple of times. So here's a young boy, excuse me, who never went to school and brought back to Japan the idea of an election. The Shogun never had an election, if you ever saw that program before. He was a military leader. Trains, all kinds of things, ideas for people to have their individual self-worth. So he was really, for a young boy, 14 years old, who never had any schooling, he made a big, big mark on Japan. We now, as I mentioned before, we run the museum. Dr. Hino Ohara was the one who raised all the funds in Japan, bought the museum, had it restored. You saw it on there when they dedicated on that day. And so far we've had in 9 years for a little over 7,000 visitors there. And usually around 70% are Japanese. Some of them living in the USA and others coming from other countries. Our push now, and Gene will be able to relate to this, because we are getting funds from the Community Preservation Act, as well as Mass Cultural Council, in terms of restoring the Carriage House to make a cultural center. And that's kind of our big push now. We've got about 2/3 of the funding so far, so we're getting there. It takes a long time, as you'll remember, Gene, right? Okay, Cultural Center. So, anyway, I've been doing a lot of talking. How about questions? Are there any questions I can answer for you? Yes, sir.
What kind of curating efforts are you putting into this museum that you now are raising money for? What kind of exhibitry do you have?
The exhibits?
Yeah.
The exhibit is the house of Captain Whitfield, as it was in the middle 1850s. Of course, excuse me, because the captain had the house raised, so that first floor that is there now, Manjiro never saw. And then they had his rooms in the back. We do tours either by appointment. In the summertime, on Sundays, we're open from noon to 4 o'clock with no appointments. Other times, anytime we do the appointments, and I keep track of that just on the calendar. We have people come out of the blue sometimes, because they'll come to the front door of the house, just assuming we're open all the time, and they'll see the hours, and then they'll see my telephone number, and I get a call. I might be mowing the lawn or something, and then my family goes crazy because I drop everything, and okay, here we go. But, we try to accommodate everything that we can. And the tour of the Manjiro Trail is all 8 of those places around Fairhaven that were part of his life. Probably many of you are familiar with Henry Huddleston Rogers. He was the benefactor of the town of Fairhaven. He was actually the vice president of Standard Oil with Rockefeller, when the oil started coming out of the ground instead of out of rails. And he had a daughter who was very sickly, and at 17 years of age, she died. He built the Millicent Library in Fairhaven. That's her name, Millicent, to her memory. He built the town hall across the street in 1894, and he did so. One of his best friends came to make the speech. A fellow whose real name is Samuel Clemens, and we know him as Mark Twain. So Mark Twain was a very good buddy of his. I understand he used to come into town very often and meet with and visit with Mr. Rogers and his wife. But Mrs. Rogers wasn't happy with the fact that Mark Twain smoked a lot of cigars. So I guess she must have complained enough. So what happened to her husband, built a hotel down the street so Mark Twain could stay there. And that's another part of the history we have there in Fairhaven that we add into the Manjiro Trail. And one other thing that's pertinent, excuse me, as you remember, in the 1930s, our president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the Delano part of the name was mother's family name. So, what happened is that grandmother and grandfather, the Delanos, had a summer house in the middle of Fairhaven. And when the president was a little boy, he would come there and his grandfather would tell him about Manjiro, because he knew Manjiro. So in 1933, from the White House, FDR wrote a letter to Toichiro, the first son of Manjiro, said, I learned about your father from my grandfather in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Also found out grandfather was part owner, John Howland Shipwrecked, saved Manjiro. By the way, we brought a few books along here, in case anyone was interested in those, and that letter is in those books, by the way. It's written by the 5th generation descendant of Manjiro, and also some of my name cards are there, in case you'd like to take them. By the way, excuse me, we have a website, and on the name card is the website address, so anytime you could go there and kind of catch up with everything we're doing, including the full version of that video you just saw. That's also on our website, okay? One of our very good friends and artist from Marion is a fellow named Peter Martin. And just to make you aware, Peter Martin is a very successful artist in the local area. He's very much into Moby Dick. And a year ago, in the Whaling Museum, they had a Manjiro exhibit. And Peter has a major part of that exhibit. It's actually a floor piece that you can walk on, and it's called Trust. It has to do with entwining Manjiro with the whole whaling thing and so forth. And so in any event, Peter Martin is coming here to Dennis on Saturday, June 22nd, with his whole exhibit called Inspiring Visions. And so I have a few of his little cards over there if anyone would like to take care of those, okay? Let me see, Cultural Center, Museum, okay. Yeah, that showing is at the Cape Cod Museum of Art in Dennis, okay? And any other questions? Yes? In Japan, it varies, and it varies not only in area, but also in the time slot. Because in some cases, there's like a ground swelling because some occasion happens. And for example, last year when we had our Manjiro Festival, we celebrated the 30th year of our sister city relationship with his hometown. So that makes a lot of press and so forth, and so there's a little kind of upswelling at that point. But maybe I can get Ayako, she's kind of nervous, but maybe I get Ayako to tell you, how about Manjiro in the schooling system in Japan?
I'm sorry?
When you were in school in Japan, how much did you hear about Manjiro?
Well, I'm from the northeast of
Yeah.
Tokyo, and then that particular area, Tokugawa was the shogun's cabinet member, and he was very, very able person, but he advised against Manjiro becoming an officially appointed translator when Commodore Perry and then the shogun negotiated certain treaty. So
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, he was,
after I came to Fairhaven, I kind of recall, maybe I heard about his name in school. But after I came here, I learned a lot about Manjiro and then mentions it. So, but some other, people in Japan, near Nakahama's hometown, I'm sure, they know about Manjiro. But
yeah, they have in Japan on one of the major stations, NHK, thing called Taiga Drama. It's like a series having to do with one person, and they kind of track his whole life and so forth. And they had one on a fellow named Ryoma. Ryoma was one of their heroes as well. And Ryoma himself was inspired by Manjiro. And there are all kinds of interconnecting things. Our board is doing a strategic plan right now, and we're looking into connections around here. And Bridgewater State University was the scene where one of Manjiro's descendants, one of the first people who introduced Western curriculum methods into Japan. And that student was a student of Manjiro who came to Bridgewater State. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have two memories about Japan from the 1930s.
Wow, great.
Well, one is that, well, first of all, I'd like to say that my mother endorsed the Brother sewing machine. And she owned Singers, but she said, Brother is a good machine.
Great.
And the other thing that I remember is that the rumor went around that there was a city in Japan that sold things to the USA, and it was USA. And they said that the city changed its name so that it wouldn't be boycotted in this country.
I see.
Is that the ancient name of that city, USA?
I'm not sure, but I remember, I'm old enough to remember after the war when the things were made in Japan, they were trying to recover and they were making things so cheap, and we'd go into a store and see something that they made in Japan and said, oh, that's cheap. But then you're right, then you can look here, it says made in USA. That was USA.
But Japan corrected its image because you wouldn't allow a camera to be sold from Japan with a Japanese name on it unless it had a sticker that said passed.
Oh, right, okay. So there was a boycott on many things. Right, exactly. Yes, sir.
There's some thinking that the Zuni people of Native American of New Mexico are in fact Japanese. Have you ever heard this or had any interaction with people who are, have you heard that or any reaction to that notion?
Did you say Rooney?
Zuni.
Zuni. Oh, Zuni.
So you're not hearing that then?
They're coming from where?
Japan.
From Japan.
And you know, that there apparently there's some DNA evidence and there's things in the style of their art and so forth. So there's this a little more than theory floating around. I just wondered if you heard any.
But I will tell you about a strange thing that occurred to me. At one time, I put in the newspaper, we were looking for more tour guides for our place. And one man from Dartmouth, who had just retired, came in for an interview. We were sitting in my little office chatting and going over things. And it was a day when I didn't have any schedule for tours, thank God. And he looked out the window and says, I think someone's at the front door. Oh, so I went over and opened the front door. There were 28 Japanese Brazilians. You may be aware that in many cases, especially after the Second World War, there were a lot of immigrants and went into Argentina. In fact, one of the presidents of Peru, I think, was Japanese. In any event, so I went out and I didn't know these. Of course, they were obviously Japanese, so I get in, hi, gozaimasu desu ka? And then he said, in one yeah, we're from Brazil. Of course, being in New Mexico, I said, bom dia, como estás? So they were a great group. They were all couples. They were all golfers. They were going all over. They just played at the Cushman Valley Golf Course out there, and they were doing like a world tour for golfing. It was incredible. Yeah, a lot of fun. Yes.
What was Nippon?
Nippon is another way of writing Japan. Nippon or Nippon. It's the same.
Was it when it was closed, or because I remember China growing up and I said, oh, Nippon, that's Japan.
No, I think it's a variation of that. Nippon or Nihon. Right?
Nippon is now official.
Is it? Yeah.
Used to be Nihon.
It was Nihon before, now official Nippon. Yeah.
Maybe the first Olympic game was held in 1964.
Oh, yeah.
I think the government decided the official pronunciation of Yamato
Oh, okay.
form.
Right. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering, did he ever come back to the United States after going back to Japan? Or-
Yes, he did. One last time. In 1870, he was on a ship in New York Harbor that was heading for Europe. He had 2 days free. He jumped on a train, came back to Fairhaven for the last time. That's the last time he saw the captain. Slept in his old bedroom and talked till the wee hours in the morning and then had to leave. But that was the last time, 1870.
And also, did he ever write a memoir, or was most of this information told
Very-
by people?
Excuse me. I guess what happened was, after he got home, he was assigned to a writer-artist by the name of Kawada Shoryo. And he actually lived with him. He was a fairly young guy, too. And he dictated his adventures for 11 and a half years and gave him all of the little drawings that he had done of whales and so forth and all that. And so that ended up in a 4-volume set called Kyosan Kiryaku. Now, we're very familiar with a Japanese fellow from Kochi, from that area, who is, we call a Manjiro scholar. He spent a lot of time in the USA, got a degree from Columbia. He's back in Tokyo now. In fact, he's on our board of directors, and he joins us monthly on Skype. But anyway, he came over with another fellow about 8 years ago. They took that Kyosan Kiryaku. By the way, there's only 11 copies of that in the world that we know of. One of them is in the Millicent Library in Fairhaven. Of course, it's in the safe. So they borrowed that, and he translated it into English, and the Spinner publication published it as Drifting to the Southeast. So you can read all of Manjiro's whole thing in English with all the drawings in there as well. In fact, just recently, thanks to Ayako's being on the ball, the one that Kyosan Kiryaku that I mentioned is written in very classic Japanese kanji. You know, the Japanese kanji are the kanji, the very complex characters, came from China, just like in other countries. And and it's funny because those kanji characters mean the same thing, but they're pronounced differently. I was telling G, when I was much younger and I decided to take an 8-month trip around the world, it took about 3.5 years, and I ended up in China and all those places. Anyway, but I was in Hong Kong when it was part of the British Protectorate. And when I went to a store to buy something to send home to my mother, of course I only spoke English. The Chinese fellow behind the counter spoke English and of course, in Chinese. Japanese fellow came up beside me, started talking to another fellow, trying to get something. He didn't speak Japanese, he didn't speak Chinese or English, and finally out of exasperation, he went like this. He knew exactly what he wanted. It's a pictograph. It says what the same thing is, interpreted the same way, pronounced differently in the two languages. It's kind of a challenge, because schooling is very difficult in Japan, or very challenging. When you're a youngster, right away you've got to start learning kanji characters. Those characters are very complex ones that you see outside of Chinese restaurants. By you finish high school, you should know about 1,200, and about 2,000 when you finish college. We also have current, what do you call them, phonetic syllabaries called katakana and hiragana, where you pronounce things the way it sounds. Okay? So we just had our, we call Ohanami. 2 weeks ago we had our Cherry Blossom Festival, and one of the things we do for the youngsters who come there, we'll write their names in Japanese. And they're written with a brushstroke like Ayako and some of the others will do. And it's done exactly how you hear it. Because you'll say to the youngster, what's your name? Penelope. I spell it, it doesn't matter how you spell it. How do you sound it? Okay, Penelope. Interesting thing. Yes?
How did you learn Japanese?
I'm sorry?
How did you learn Japanese?
Well, I will say that's a long question. But anyway, when I was in, I went to UMass Amherst. I was in ROTC. If you weren't a veteran but disabled, I was in Air Force ROTC. When I graduated, I got my lieutenant bar. Ended up next 5 years in the Air Force. I was during the Cold War with Russia. I was in B-52 bombers. We were stationed in the Dow Air Force Base in Bangor, Maine. Some of those bombers are ready to go to war, if you remember. And what we used to do is take off from there, fly over to Spain, refuel in the air over Spain from our tankers, do a loop in the Mediterranean, refuel again, back over across the Atlantic, 24 hours later, land in Bangor, Maine. Did it 15 times, never landed in Europe. So when I got out, I had my military, I had no girlfriend, obviously, by the time. And so I decided to get on the ground. I started out from London on a 3-speed bicycle. And about 1,200 kilometers later, I decided that was enough on a bicycle. I was visiting my pen pal in Ireland, so I bought a motor scooter, you know, scooter, little wheels and so forth, 150 cc's. And what I thought might be an 8-month trip took me 3.5 years around the world to 31 countries. And I always wanted, you know, it's really my life-changing journey that I made. And I always wanted to get involved with people and see how the culture is in every place. And if you want to check on culture, you have to make at least attempt at the language, local language. So I had 3 years of French in high school, a year of German in college. When I went to Spain, I stayed in a little pension where no one spoke English. So I used French to learn Spanish, and the Spanish, Italian was much easier. I taught Latin at one time, it helped. And then I had to get into Greek and Arabic. I was in the Arabic countries for 4 months. And then, of course, I went to Australia and just had to get used to the accent. I spent 11 months in Australia, and from Brisbane, Australia, I was going to go to Japan. Bought a small book of Japanese grammar, very different grammar. And I worked on ships, by the way. Now, I always had the scooter thrown in. By the way, the scooter's in my garage, it's running again. Anyway, if you're ready. So, in any event, so I got this little book of Japanese grammar, and then as I went there, when I had free time, I would study. And I went to Hong Kong first, then Taiwan, and finally to Yokohama. And then I did 8.5 months, no, 5.5 months, about 8,500 kilometers around Japan. From the northern tip of Hokkaido to the southern tip of Kyushu, all over Japan. So when we teach Japan and Japanese and all that, they always have me do the geography part, because I remember that map all the time, okay? So, and then I came home finally and tried to settle down. My home is actually in Wilmington, up near Lowell, north of Boston. And I came down to New Bedford to work with a missionary priest that I had met in Japan. He was from Beverly, Massachusetts, and Ayako was studying at UMass Dartmouth, which was SMTI and then SMU, and we met in New Bedford. So, go figure, isn't it? Yeah. So, in any event, yeah, it was just an incredible opportunity that I had. When we came down here, I came down to work with the Father Coleman Pounding, his name was, at Regina Pacha Center, another Spanish thing, and I saw that in New Bedford, and it was great. So, you know, people were so good to me as I traveled, because if we're all together sitting in a Greek restaurant, we're going to have breakfast or something, we're all kind of like in a bubble compared to the other folks around. So, but I'm sitting there by myself, my scooter's out there loaded with my guitar and all that other junk, and someone will walk in and say, you know, and I'll look at them and they smile, I say, I say, good morning, how are you? Is this Spanish? You speak Greek? Who passed out? Where you go with all this stuff on a scooter? And I said, well, and then I started to say, oh my God, in 10 minutes my kid's coming home from school, could you wait? Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about it. So now, we wait for 10 minutes, kids come home from school, we start talking about where I'm going, all the kinds of different things. Bring out the guitar, we have a jam session, next thing you know, mother's making dinner. You've just been adopted by the family. The lesson you should pay for, but that's where you learn about the culture. And so, luckily I got a degree in engineering, so they wouldn't let me pay, so I repaired more scooters and toasters and bundles and all that, just to get back. And it was, as I say, throughout the I was alone all the time, 3.5 years, but people were incredible. When I got back and started looking back at all the things and ended up marrying Ayako, then I looked back, Japan seemed kind of strange, not strange, seemed very special in terms of the friendliness and the openness of people. So I went back to my diary, I had a complete 250 pages of handwritten diary, went back to the diary and I looked at it and I said, I was in Japan 162 days. Of those days, 141 days in private homes with new friends. So, because I love Japan. And I got the final answer to it. Permanent connection. Any other questions? Yes?
As a historian, I've dabbled in studies of the various generations of dynasties or periods of the particular of the 18th and 19th century. I believe that the period of 1837 to 54 was known as the Tempo period. Is that correct?
That's probably correct. Ayako would know more about that.
I found a coin that was like a rectangular silver coin.
Wow.
From the,
Did you say 1830?
37 to 54, I believe.
Well,
It's
that's,
called Ichi-Bu-Gin.
yeah.
That was
Hey, wow, that's
that was the
interesting.
type of.
That's Manjiro's time, obviously, right?
Exactly, yes.
1853 is when Curry came, and then 54 he came again. Wow,
So it's-
treasure. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Do you have copies of the ship's logs of when they picked the kids up? And where are they kept, the real one, you know, the actual ship's logs?
The full original logbook is owned by Robert Whitfield. He's the 5th generation descendant, lives in Florida. Up until a year and a half ago, when we had our festival, it became part of the Manjiro exhibit at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. However, since then, they've redone the Whaling Museum in Tosa Shimizu, our sister city, so the original logbook is there, but a copy of it is still in New Bedford. And we have a copy of certain pages, especially the page where they met at Torishima, which we show people and go over with them. In fact, there's a copy of it in that book over there as well. Anything else? All right, well, that's it.